Welcome to Dark Lantern Stories. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is there right now. In Blackstone Hollow, the church bell had not rung for over 50 years. Then one winter night, it rang again from beneath the ground. In the autumn of 1894, on the northern edge of Blackstone Hollow, where the fog sat low against the hills and crows gathered on broken rooftops before dusk, there stood an abandoned church that no one entered after sunset. Its bell had not rung in over 50 years. Its stained glass windows were cracked like frozen water. Ivy had climbed across its stone walls and wrapped itself around the bell tower as if nature itself were trying to pull the building back into the earth. Children were warned never to go near it. Travelers avoided the road that passed its gates. Even shepherds led their animals around it in wide circles. And yet everyone in Blackstone Hollow knew one thing about the church. Something was buried beneath it. No one agreed on what. But everyone agreed it had been sealed there for a reason. The church had once been called St. Bartholomew's Chapel. Built in 1837 by stone masons who came from the southern counties with wagons full of tools and hands hardened by cold weather. It had stood at the center of village life for decades. Weddings, burials, baptisms, winter prayers by candlelight. Bells ringing over the valley every Sunday morning. Then one night in 1848, the bells rang after midnight. They rang until sunrise, and by morning, the chapel doors had been nailed shut from the outside. No service was ever held there again. No priest returned. No one spoke openly of what happened. Years passed. Moss covered the steps. Graves sank into soft earth behind leaning iron fences, and silence settled over St. Bartholomew's, like dust. By 1894, only one man still claimed to know the truth. His name was Samuel Vale. He was 78 years old and nearly blind in one eye. He lived in a weather-beaten cottage near the old road with a fireplace that smoked too much and shelves full of things no one wanted. Rusted keys, maps, bottles, broken clocks. He had once been the church caretaker as a boy. He rang the bell, swept the floors, lit candles before sunrise, and on stormy nights he said he heard something moving below the floorboards beneath the altar. No one believed him. Or perhaps they did, and simply wished not to. One October morning a stranger arrived in Blackstone Hollow. His name was Thomas Reed, 29 years old. Tall, sharp-featured, a historian from the city with ink stains on his fingers and notebooks packed into a leather satchel. He had spent the last 3 years traveling through villages, collecting stories forgotten by official history. Fires, famines, vanishings, buried letters, lost churches. He came to Blackstone Hollow because of a single note he found hidden inside parish records in the county archive. The note was unsigned and dated 1848. It read, "Do not let anyone dig beneath St. Bartholomew's. Seal the lower chamber. Let God bury what men cannot understand." Thomas read the line 10 times before deciding to travel north. Now he stood before Samuel Vale's cottage while wind moved through dry leaves around his boots. Samuel opened the door slowly and stared with one pale eye. "You're not from here." Thomas shook his head. Samuel stepped aside without another word. Inside the cottage smelled of ash and wet wood. Thomas explained why he had come. He showed Samuel the note. The old man read it once, then set it down beside the fire. "Burn that paper." Thomas smiled. "I came for answers." Samuel looked toward the window where fog pressed against the glass. Answers buried under stone should stay buried. Thomas asked him if there really was a lower chamber beneath the church. Samuel said nothing for so long Thomas thought he would not answer. Then the old man whispered, "Yes." Thomas leaned forward. And what was in it? Samuel's hands shook against the arm of his chair. I never saw it, only heard it. Thomas frowned. Heard what? Samuel lifted his eye slowly, scratching under the altar, night after night. Thomas did not speak. Samuel continued. In 1848, the priest ordered us to dig beneath the stone floor, said there was an old burial chamber below, older than the church itself, older than the graves, older than Blackstone Hollow. He thought relics were hidden there, gold perhaps, bones of saints, something sacred. But what we found was no relic. Thomas sat motionless. Samuel swallowed hard. We found a door beneath the church. Thomas felt the room grow colder. A door. Samuel nodded. Iron, covered in symbols carved deep into it, locked from the outside with chains black as coal. Thomas asked who locked it. Samuel stared into the fire. No one knew. The chains were older than the church foundations, older than any stone we laid there. Thomas's pulse quickened, and they opened it. Samuel closed his eyes. The priest did. Thomas waited. Samuel's voice dropped to almost nothing, and by morning St. Bartholomew's was closed forever. Wind rattled the shutters. Thomas leaned closer. What was inside? Samuel opened his eye and met Thomas's stare. Something breathing. Silence filled the room. Thomas laughed nervously. Samuel did not. Before Thomas could ask another question, 3 knocks struck the cottage door. Both men froze, slow, heavy, hollow against old wood. Samuel's face lost color. Who are you expecting? Thomas whispered. No one, Samuel said. Another knock, then another. Samuel rose, trembling, and crossed the room. He did not open the door. Instead, he looked through the side window. His breathing stopped. Thomas moved beside him. Outside, the fog rolled thick across the road. No one stood at the door, but in the wet earth beneath the threshold were fresh marks. Long grooves cut into the mud, like something heavy had been dragged across it, from the direction of St. Bartholomew's church. Samuel stepped back from the glass. It knows you came. Thomas stared at him. What knows I came? Samuel looked toward the distant hill where the church sat hidden in fog, what we buried beneath it. That night Thomas could not sleep. He rented the room above the tavern at the edge of Blackstone Hollow and sat by candlelight reading notes until dawn. Rain tapped against the window. Somewhere outside a dog barked and then went quiet. Near midnight he heard the church bell, one slow toll drifting through the fog. Then silence. Thomas opened the window. Cold air rushed in. The abandoned church sat on the hill barely visible through mist. No bells should ring there. Yet he knew what he heard. The next morning he climbed the hill alone. St. Bartholomew stood before him in silence. Its wooden doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. Ravens perched along the roofline. Weeds pushed through cracked stone steps. Thomas crossed the churchyard past tilted gravestones swallowed by moss. Many dates were unreadable. One caught his eye. 1848, several graves from the same year. Too many. No names. Only carved crosses. He pushed open the chapel door. It groaned into darkness. Dust filled the cold air inside. Broken pews leaned sideways. Rot stained the ceiling. Fragments of colored glass scattered across stone like frozen jewels. At the far end stood the altar. Beneath it, beneath centuries of dust and silence, lay the place Samuel feared. Thomas walked toward it slowly. Then he heard it. Scratch, soft, faint, beneath the floor. He froze. Scratch, scratch, directly below the altar stone. Thomas stared at the floor while his breath clouded before him in the cold. The scratching stopped. Then something struck the underside of the stone from below. Once, hard enough to shake dust from the altar. Thomas stepped back. His candle flickered, and in that trembling light he saw fresh dirt pushing upward through cracks in the floorboards beneath the altar, as if something buried deep below had begun to dig its way out. Thomas Reed stood motionless in the ruined silence of St. Bartholomew's chapel, while loose dirt spilled through the cracks beneath the altar and scattered across the ancient stone floor like black powder. The candle in his hand trembled hard enough to splash wax onto his fingers, but he barely felt it. His eyes remained fixed on the altar. The scratching had stopped, but the fresh soil had not stopped shifting. Small grains slid outward from beneath the stone base and formed a dark line across the floor. Something below was moving. Thomas stepped back slowly. The chapel groaned in the wind. Rain tapped against broken stained glass high above. Somewhere in the rafters, a raven fluttered and settled again into silence. Then the floor struck upward from beneath with a violent thud. Thomas stumbled and nearly dropped the candle. Dust exploded from the altar cloth and drifted through the cold air. Another thud followed, louder, stronger, directly below the altar. Thomas backed away until his shoulders touched the front pew. His breath came sharp in the freezing air. Then silence returned. Thick, heavy, waiting. He stayed there for nearly a full minute listening. Nothing. Only the wind pressing against cracked windows. At last he lowered the candle and moved forward again. The stone beneath the altar had shifted. Barely, but enough. One corner now sat uneven against the floor. Fresh dirt ringed its edges. Thomas knelt. His fingers brushed the stone. Cold, wet. He wedged both hands beneath the lifted corner and pushed. It did not move. He tried again. Nothing. Then he noticed an iron ring half buried under the dirt near the base, hidden for decades. Thomas wiped it clean and pulled. Stone scraped against stone. The slab slid aside just enough to reveal darkness below. Cold air rushed upward from the opening, air that smelled of damp earth, rust, and something else, something stale, like a sealed room opened after many generations. Thomas held the candle over the hole. Stone steps spiraled downward into blackness. The flame bent sharply toward the stairwell, as if drawn downward by unseen breath. He swallowed. Samuel had been telling the truth. There was a lower chamber. Thomas glanced once toward the chapel doors. Rain hammered the roof harder now. He should leave, return with tools, return with help. But he knew if he walked away now, he might never gather the courage to descend again. He climbed through the opening and began down the steps. The staircase was narrow and ancient, older than the church by centuries. Water dripped from the ceiling. Moss clung to stone. His candlelight stretched long shadows along curved walls, carved with symbols worn nearly smooth by time. Some looked like eyes. Others like circles within circles, marks not Christian, not Roman, older than both. 20 steps down, the air grew colder. 30 steps, and the smell deepened. 40 steps, and Thomas reached the bottom. A chamber opened before him beneath the church, round, built from black stone. The ceiling arched overhead like the inside of a tomb. Chains hung rusted from iron hooks in the walls, thick enough to anchor ships, some broken, some still locked around nothing. In the center stood an iron door lying flat across the floor like a lid. Massive, covered in carvings, one side bent upward, as if forced open long ago. Thomas approached slowly. The carvings matched Samuel's description. Strange symbols cut deep into black metal. Around the frame lay scattered pieces of old wood and shattered lantern glass buried under dust. Someone had opened it. In 1848, Thomas crouched beside the iron lid. The hinges were broken inward. Whatever it once sealed had not been meant to stay open. His candlelight drifted over the opening beneath. A shaft descended into darkness below the chamber. Deeper still, no end visible. Thomas leaned over the edge. The darkness seemed to swallow the flame. Then he heard it. Breathing. Slow. Wet. Rising from far below. Thomas recoiled so hard he struck the stone floor behind him. His candle rolled from his hand and spun against the wall, flame still alive. He scrambled backward from the shaft. The breathing continued, slow, ancient, real. Then a whisper rose from the dark beneath the iron door. Thomas could not make out words. Only a voice like dry leaves dragged across stone. He grabbed the candle and ran. He climbed the stairwell 2 steps at a time, boots slipping against wet rock. He burst through the altar opening into the ruined chapel and shoved the stone slab back across the hole. It scraped shut with a scream against the floor. Thomas stood over it, gasping. Then from below came one heavy strike. The slab jumped beneath his boots. Another strike, louder. Dust fell from the altar. Thomas ran from St. Bartholomew's without looking back. By the time he reached Blackstone, hollow rain had become a storm. He pounded on Samuel Vale's cottage door until the old man opened it. One look at Thomas's face told him everything. You opened it. Thomas stepped inside, dripping with rain. I did not open anything. It was already open. Samuel went pale. Thomas told him what he saw. The stairwell, the chains, the iron lid, the shaft, the breathing. When he finished, Samuel sat down heavily beside the fire. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Samuel whispered, "The priest said it was a crypt when we found it." Thomas looked up. But it was not. Samuel nodded. "We thought bones were buried there. Sacred relics, perhaps. Instead, we found that iron door. Father Matthias ordered it opened before sunrise. 6 men helped lift the chains. It took hours. When we broke the seal, cold air poured out like winter itself. Then we heard movement below. Thomas leaned closer. What happened next? Samuel stared into the flames. Father Matthias climbed down with a lantern. We waited above. Then he screamed. Thomas felt every hair on his arms rise. Samuel continued. We pulled him back up by rope. He had torn his own hands bloody trying to climb. He kept shouting, "Close it! Close it now!" Thomas swallowed. Did he say what he saw? Samuel nodded slowly. He said there was another chamber beneath, and inside it were bones stacked from floor to ceiling, thousands, and something alive moving between them. Thunder shook the cottage windows. Thomas whispered, "What did they do?" Samuel's voice trembled. They sealed it. Before dawn, chains, nails, stone, everything we had. But the scratching began that same night, beneath the altar, under the floor. Then the bell rang after midnight on its own, every night for 7 nights. By the 8th morning, Father Matthias was gone, vanished from his room. Thomas felt sick. The graves behind the church. Samuel nodded. 7 unnamed graves. 1 for each night the bell rang. Men who helped open the chamber. But not Father Matthias. He was never found. Thomas sat, frozen. Rain battered the roof. Then both men heard it. One toll of the church bell across the valley. Deep, hollow, impossible. Samuel shut his eyes. It has started again. Thomas rose. Why now? Samuel looked at him. Because someone opened the altar. Thomas turned toward the window. Through sheets of rain, the church hill disappeared beneath fog. Another bell toll rolled through the valley. Then another. Then another. The bell had not rung in over 50 years, yet now it rang without stopping. By dawn, the entire village gathered in the square. Men with lanterns, women with blankets pulled tight over their shoulders, children clutching parents' hands, all staring up at St. Bartholomew's as the bell rang through the storm. Thomas stood among them with Samuel at his side. No one spoke. Then the bell stopped. Silence swept over Blackstone Hollow, thick enough to feel. A woman near the well screamed. Everyone turned. Mud had begun to rise through the cobblestones at the center of the square. Wet black earth bubbling upward between stones. Then more appeared beneath the baker's door, beneath the tavern steps, across the village road, fresh dirt pushing upward from below as if something buried deep beneath Blackstone Hollow had begun to wake beneath every home at once. The black earth kept rising through the village square like water from a broken spring, thick and wet and shining under the gray dawn, while the people of Blackstone Hollow stood frozen around it in silence, too afraid to step closer and too afraid to look away. Thomas Reed watched mud spill between the cobblestones and spread across the road in twisting lines like veins beneath skin. More earth pushed upward beneath the baker's doorstep. More beneath the old well. More beside the tavern wall where children had stood only moments before. Women pulled them back screaming. Men grabbed shovels and lanterns, though none knew what they meant to do with either. Samuel Vale stood beside Thomas, gripping his cane so tightly his knuckles whitened against the wood. "It is spreading," he whispered. Thomas could barely answer. "How far?" Samuel did not reply. Then a cracking sound split the square. One of the stones near the well broke in half. A plume of dirt burst upward, and something white rolled free across the mud. A child cried out. Thomas stepped closer. Bone. Human bone. A skull rose from the earth, with empty sockets packed full of black soil. Then another, then ribs, broken femurs, fragments of jaw. Bones buried deep beneath the village were surfacing through the stone as if the dead themselves were being forced upward from the earth. Panic erupted at once. Villagers ran in every direction, some toward their homes, some toward the fields, some simply away from the square without knowing where they were going. Thomas stood staring at the skull half buried in the mud. Rain washed dark streams from its hollow eyes. Samuel gripped his sleeve. "Get inside." But before either man moved, the church bell rang again. One deafening toll from the hill above the village. Every face lifted toward St. Bartholomew's. Through the fog, its bell tower loomed over Blackstone Hollow like a finger pointed at the sky. The bell swung, though no hand touched it. Thomas could see it from the square. Dark iron moving against gray air. Back and forth. Slow, heavy. Another toll. Then another. Samuel whispered, "It wants us there." Thomas looked at him. "Wants who there?" Samuel's voice cracked. "All of us." By noon the village gathered in the tavern. No fires burned in homes that day. No one ate. The square remained flooded with black earth and bone beneath steady rain. The mayor, Edwin Cross, stood near the hearth with the water dripping from his coat collar while Thomas and Samuel spoke before the crowd. At first no one wanted to hear it. The hidden chamber beneath the church, the chains, the sealed shaft, the scratching, the bones, the breathing below. But fear has a way of making impossible things easier to believe, especially when skulls rise through the village road. When Thomas finished, silence held the room. Then an old woman at the back whispered, "My grandfather warned us never to disturb the altar." Another voice said, "Mine too." Then another, and another. Stories passed down through generations like warnings no one remembered the reason for. Never ring the church bell after dark. Never dig beneath St. Bartholomew's. Never sleep inside earshot of the chapel in October. Forgotten warnings suddenly felt alive again. Mayor Cross rubbed both hands over his face. "Then we seal it again." Samuel shook his head. "With what?" Cross answered with stone. "Iron, timber, whatever we have. Thomas looked at Samuel. The old man's face remained pale. "It was not enough the first time," Samuel said. The room fell silent. Thomas stood. "Then we find what is below, and finish what they could not." Many voices rose at once, some angry, some terrified. Cross slammed his fist against the table. "Enough!" He looked at Thomas. "If we do nothing." Thomas glanced toward the shuttered windows where the church bell echoed through the rain. "It spreads." Cross swallowed hard. "Then we go tonight." By sunset, 12 men stood at the gates of St. Bartholomew's with lanterns, rope, axes, iron bars, and enough fear to fill the ruined church before any of them stepped inside. Rain had eased to mist. Fog rolled across the graves behind leaning headstones. Ravens watched from the bell tower, but made no sound. Thomas led them through the broken doors. Samuel refused to stay behind, despite his age. The villagers carried lanterns down the nave and gathered around the altar where Thomas had reopened the stone. Dirt now covered the floor in a thick ring around it. The slab had shifted again by several inches. Something had struck it from below repeatedly throughout the day. Thomas could see cracks along the edge. Cross stared down at it. "Open it." 2 men wedged iron bars beneath the slab. It scraped aside inch by inch until the stairwell yawned open once more. Cold air rushed upward. Every lantern flame bent downward into the darkness. No one spoke. Thomas took the first step down. The others followed. They descended in silence into the lower chamber. The Blackstone room waited unchanged except for one thing. More chains lay broken across the floor now, freshly snapped. Links twisted apart as if by immense force. The iron door still lay open in the center, but from the shaft beneath it came a faint pale light. Blue, like moonlight underwater. Samuel nearly fell against the wall. Thomas moved toward the shaft. The others followed close behind. Lanterns held high. They peered over the edge. Far below, the blue glow pulsed softly, and beneath it, Thomas saw movement. Something pale moving in circles beneath the light. Bones, thousands of them, shifting, turning, sliding over one another like a tide. The villagers recoiled in horror. Cross whispered, "Dear God." Then a voice rose from below. Human, weak, barely breathing. "Help me." Thomas froze. He knew that voice, though he had never heard it before. Samuel's cane clattered against stone. "Father Matthias," the old man whispered. The voice came again. "Help me." It echoed up through the shaft like air passing through a grave. Some men crossed themselves. One dropped his lantern and ran for the stairs. Others followed. Panic tore through the chamber. Only Thomas, Cross, Samuel, and 3 others remained. The voice below wept now. "Please." Thomas looked at Samuel. Impossible. Samuel stared into the darkness with tears in his eyes. He vanished 46 years ago. Then the blue glow brightened. Bones below began moving faster, faster, swirling in a spiral like leaves inside a storm. The voice became laughter, not human laughter. Too deep, too many voices folded into one. The remaining men stumbled back from the shaft. Cross shouted, close it now." But before anyone moved, a pale hand gripped the edge of the iron opening, fingers thin as roots, skin red gray over bone. Then another. Then a face rose from the darkness. Thomas's breath left him. A priest's face, skin torn, eyes white with age, mouth packed with dirt. Father Matthias climbed from the shaft, still wearing decayed black robes hanging in strips from his frame. Soil poured from his sleeves. He lifted his head toward them and smiled with broken black teeth. Samuel screamed. Father Matthias stepped onto the chamber floor. More hands rose behind him from the shaft. Dozens, skeletal fingers gripping iron from below, pulling themselves upward out of darkness. Thomas grabbed Cross by the arm. "Run!" They fled for the stairwell as the chamber behind them filled with scraping bone against metal, and the church bell above roared through the fog like thunder across the valley. Thomas Reed hit the stairwell first, with Mayor Edwin Cross close behind, while the lower chamber erupted into chaos beneath St. Bartholomew's chapel, and the sound that chased them upward was worse than footsteps, because it was thousands of bones dragging across stone all at once, like dry branches pulled through narrow tunnels beneath the earth. Lanterns swung wildly against wet walls. Men shoved past one another in blind panic. Samuel Vale stumbled on the lower steps, and Thomas caught him by the coat collar before he fell backward into the darkness. Cross slammed his shoulder against another villager to keep moving. Behind them, Father Matthias climbed from the shaft with slow, jerking movements, while pale, skeletal hands kept rising around him from the black opening one after another, like the dead being poured upward from beneath the church itself. Thomas reached the altar opening and pulled himself onto the chapel floor. Cold air struck his face. He turned and dragged Samuel after him. Cross and the remaining men spilled out behind them, covered in dust and mud and terror. Thomas shouted the stone. "Move the stone!" 4 men threw themselves against the slab. It scraped halfway over the opening. Then something struck from below. The stone jumped sideways. 1 man screamed as his hand was crushed between the slab and the floor. Blood streaked across the altar. Another blow hit from beneath, stronger. The slab tilted upward. Thomas seized an iron bar and jammed it into the gap. Cross grabbed the other end. Push! They forced it down while the entire chapel shook with impacts from below. Then from the darkness came Father Matthias's voice. Muffled, close beneath the stone. "Let me in." Samuel collapsed to his knees beside the altar. Thomas drove the iron bar harder against the slab, while others shoved broken pews against it. Another strike shook the floor, then another, then silence. No one breathed. Rain whispered against the broken windows. Somewhere overhead, the bell still swung and tolled into the fog. Then a thin line of black soil began pushing through the cracks around the altar stone. Thomas stared in disbelief. It was forcing its way up. Cross wiped blood from his brow. "Burn it." Thomas turned. "What?" Cross pointed toward the altar. "Burn the whole church." Samuel looked up sharply. "No," Cross shouted, "it cannot leave this hill." More dirt spilled through the cracks. Something beneath scratched hard enough to vibrate the stone. Thomas knew Cross was right. If what lay below reached the village, there would be no stopping it. Men overturned pews onto the altar. Dry wood cracked against stone. Lantern oil was poured across the floor. Samuel struggled to his feet. This place held the dead of Blackstone Hollow. Cross met his stare. Better the dead than the living. Thomas struck a match. For one moment he hesitated. St. Bartholomew's had stood for over half a century. Weddings, burials, prayers. Generations under its roof. Then the scratching came again. Louder. Furious now. Something slammed beneath the altar so hard the pew legs bounced against the floor. Thomas dropped the match. Fire rushed through oil in a bright orange wave. Flames climbed the piled wood at once. Heat filled the ruined chapel. Men ran for the doors. Thomas pulled Samuel toward the entrance while smoke curled into the rafters. Outside they stumbled into the churchyard as St. Bartholomew's began to burn against the night sky. Flames licked through shattered stained glass. Bell ropes burned through above. The bell gave one last violent toll before dropping from the tower and crashing through the chapel roof in a shower of sparks. Villagers gathered at the foot of the hill, watching in silence while fire consumed the church. Wind carried embers over gravestones. Thomas stood beside Samuel as smoke rose into the black sky. Then the ground shook. Once, deep below the hill, graves trembled. Headstones cracked. A roar rose from beneath the burning church, not human, not animal, something vast and buried. The villagers backed away in terror. Firelight flashed across pale faces. Then the floor of St. Bartholomew's collapsed inward. Stone, timber, and bell tower vanished into the earth in one thunderous motion as the lower chamber caved in beneath the flames. Sparks exploded into the sky. Dust rolled across the hill like storm clouds. And then silence. Nothing remained where the church had stood but a burning crater filled with rubble and broken stone. No bell, no altar, no stairwell, only fire sinking slowly into darkness. Some villagers fell to their knees. Others wept openly. Samuel stared without blinking. Thomas could not move. By dawn the fire died. Rain returned and turned ash to mud. St. Bartholomew's was gone. But Blackstone Hollow did not sleep. No one entered the square. No one touched the bones still scattered through the mud. Men kept watch through the night with lanterns and axes, though none knew what they hoped to defend against. Thomas remained awake in the tavern window, watching the hill through gray rain. At sunrise, Samuel arrived at his door, soaked through and pale with fear. It did not end, he said. Thomas followed him outside. Fresh black earth covered the village road again. Not from beneath the church this time. From the crater itself, a dark trail of soil stretched downhill through wet grass into Blackstone Hollow, like something had crawled from the ruins during the night. Thomas followed it to the square. The trail wound between cottages, past the well, and ended at the oldest house in the village, Father Matthias's former residence, abandoned since 1848. Its front door stood open. Mud streaked the threshold. Samuel whispered no. Thomas pushed the door wider. Inside, the air smelled of mold and wet earth. Furniture sat untouched beneath sheets of dust. Water dripped from the ceiling into rusted bowls on warped floorboards. The mud trail led upstairs. Thomas climbed slowly with Samuel behind him. At the end of the hallway stood a single locked room. Thomas kicked the door. It burst inward, a small study. Rotting bookshelves, broken desk. A bed frame collapsed against one wall and scratched into the wooden floorboards over and over in hundreds of desperate lines were the same 3 words. Do not open it. Samuel covered his mouth. Thomas knelt beside the scratches. They looked old, decades old, carved deep with a knife until splinters curled from the wood. Father Matthias had written them before he vanished. Then Thomas noticed loose floorboards beneath the bed. He pried them up with his hands. Beneath lay a bundle wrapped in black cloth. Inside was a journal, leather-bound, water-stained. Father Matthias's handwriting filled every page. Thomas opened it with shaking hands while rain tapped against broken glass. The final entries were nearly unreadable. Ink smeared as if written in panic. We opened the lower gate. Beneath the bones was not a crypt, but a prison, older than the church, older than the village, built by those who came before to contain what fed beneath the hill. The bones were offerings. We broke the seal. God forgive us. It wears the dead like clothing. Samuel sank against the wall. Thomas turned pages faster. The final entry stopped halfway through a sentence. It is learning our names. Then blank pages. Thomas stared. A floorboard creaked behind him. He froze. Samuel lifted his head slowly toward the doorway. A wet footprint stood in the dust just beyond the threshold. Then another. Fresh mud on old wood. Thomas rose. Neither had heard anyone enter. A shadow crossed the hall outside. Slow. Dragging. Samuel whispered it followed us. Thomas closed the journal and backed toward the window. Then Father Matthias stepped into the doorway. burned robes hanging from blackened bone, skin charred from the church fire, soil falling from his mouth as he smiled, and behind him, the hallway filled with the dead. Father Matthias stood in the doorway of the ruined upstairs study while rain streaked the broken window behind Thomas Reed and Samuel Vale, and the narrow hall beyond, filled slowly with bodies moving through shadow. The priest's black robes hung from him in burned strips. His skin was cracked and charred like wood left too long in flame. Soil spilled from his sleeves and mouth and fell wet against the floorboards. His eyes were pale and empty. Yet they held Thomas as if they still remembered him. Behind him came the others, skeletal shapes wrapped in rags, bone scraping against plaster walls, mud trailing behind their feet. The dead of Blackstone Hollow had climbed out from beneath St. Bartholomew's and followed them home. Thomas backed toward the window, clutching Father Matthias's journal against his chest. Samuel's breathing came shallow beside him. Father Matthias opened his mouth. When he spoke, many voices came with him. Some whispered, some groaned, some sounded like children, some ancient, all layered inside one throat. You opened the path. Thomas shook his head. No. The priest took one dragging step into the room. You returned what was buried. Thomas looked at the journal in his hand. It wears the dead like clothing. He understood now. Whatever had been imprisoned beneath the church had no face of its own. It had risen through bones and memory and flesh long dead and wrapped itself in whoever it found. First Father Matthias, then the others buried with the church. Samuel whispered the window. Thomas turned. The study overlooked the muddy lane behind the house. One story down, dangerous but possible. The dead moved closer in the doorway. Thomas smashed the glass with a chair leg. Cold rain and wind burst inside. Father Matthias lunged. Thomas shoved Samuel through the opening first. The old man vanished into darkness below with a painful cry. Thomas leaped after him just as skeletal fingers brushed his coat. He hit the mud hard and rolled. Pain burst through his shoulder. Samuel lay beside the wall, gasping but alive. Behind them, the broken window glowed pale with lantern light from inside the room. Shapes leaned out through it. Thomas pulled Samuel up and they ran. Mud sucked at their boots. Rain blinded them. Behind them came the sound of bodies dropping from the window one after another into the lane. By the time they reached the square, bells were ringing again, though St. Bartholomew's no longer stood. The sound came from underground now, deep beneath the village. Every villager had gathered in the rain with lanterns and shovels and axes, all staring toward the road as Thomas and Samuel emerged from the darkness. Father Matthias and the dead followed behind them into the square. Mothers screamed. Men stepped back. Cross raised a rifle with shaking hands. Thomas shouted no, but the shot had already fired. The bullet tore through Father Matthias's chest. He barely moved. More dead figures spilled from the fog behind him. 20, 30, perhaps more. Bones beneath cloth, empty eye sockets packed with earth. Villagers fled in terror. Cross fired again, useless. Thomas climbed onto the well ledge and shouted over the panic, "Listen to me." Some turned, most did not. Samuel held up the journal. Father Matthias wrote how it was sealed the first time. The words cut through the chaos. Thomas grabbed the journal and read aloud despite rain washing over the pages. The prison was bound not by chains alone, but by burial. Stone and bell and bone. The hill must remain closed. The dead must remain below. If the gate opens, the hill must be returned to earth. Thomas looked up. Cross understood first. Bury the hill. Thomas nodded. Not just the church, the entire hill. The villagers stared. Then another bell toll rose from beneath the ground so violently that windows shattered along the square. The earth beneath their feet trembled. Cross shouted to the men, "Bring the powder." Blackstone Hollow kept blasting powder in storage for clearing rock near the quarry. Barrels were dragged through the rain toward the ruined hill while the dead entered the square. Father Matthias walked ahead of them, smiling with soil packed between broken teeth. Thomas and Cross led a group uphill through the storm, while others held the line with fire and tools in the square below. Torches were thrown at the dead. Bones blackened, but still they walked. By the time Thomas reached the crater where St. Bartholomew's once stood, the rain had become a torrent. Smoke still rose from wet ash. They rolled powder barrels into the center of the collapse where the altar and lower chamber had fallen. Thomas helped pack the cavity with every barrel they had. Cross lit the fuse. They ran down the slope, through rain and mud. The fuse hissed blue behind them. Father Matthias turned toward the hill as if hearing it. The dead paused. Thomas threw himself behind the stone wall at the square's edge, Samuel beside him. Then the hill exploded. Fire tore upward into the storm like the earth itself had split open. Stone blasted skyward. Mud and ash and ancient bones rained over Blackstone Hollow. The ground buckled beneath the village. Windows burst, roof tiles shattered. Villagers fell to the ground, covering their heads. A roar rose from beneath the hill, so deep Thomas felt it in his ribs. Then silence. Rain fell through drifting smoke. Slowly Thomas lifted his head. The hill was gone. Where St. Bartholomew's had stood was now a collapsed scar of stone and earth, sliding inward upon itself. Hundreds of tons of rock had buried the lower chamber beneath the weight of the hillside. Father Matthias stood in the square, facing the ruins. Then cracks spread across his burned skin. Soil spilled from his mouth. His body collapsed inward. Bones dropped into mud. Robes fell empty. Around him the others fell the same way. One by one, ribs, skulls, cloth, mud, silence. Only rain remained. No bells, no movement, no breathing beneath the earth. Dawn broke gray over Blackstone Hollow. Villagers stood among scattered bones and mud and broken stone as the storm finally passed. No one spoke for a long time. They buried the bones behind the ruins, beneath a cairn of stone, with no names carved into it. The hill where St. Bartholomew's once stood was fenced and left untouched. No one built there again. Thomas Reed stayed in Blackstone Hollow another month, helping record every detail before winter closed the roads. He copied Father Matthias's journal by hand and sealed the original inside a locked iron chest. Samuel Vale died that winter in his sleep by the fire with peace on his face for the first time in decades. Thomas buried him overlooking the collapsed hill. Before leaving, Thomas climbed the rise one final evening. Snow had begun falling over the valley. The ruins lay quiet beneath white drifts. No bells rang. No mud rose through the earth. No scratching beneath stone. Yet, as Thomas stood there in the fading light, he noticed something half exposed near the edge of the collapse where rain had washed earth away. Iron. He knelt in the snow and brushed it clean, a ring fixed to black metal, set into stone. Another door, smaller than the first, older, still sealed. Thomas covered it again with soil and snow. Then he walked away without speaking of it to anyone. Some doors history does not need reopened. And if you ever find yourself passing through an empty valley where an old church once stood, but the hill above it seems strangely bare, and if the wind carries something that sounds almost like a bell beneath the earth after midnight, keep walking. Do not stop. Do not dig. And whatever you do, Do not ask what was buried beneath the abandoned church. Thank you for joining us tonight on Dark Lantern Stories. If this story kept you with us until the very end, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is there right now. And tell us this. If you had found the second iron door beneath the snow, would you have opened it, or would you have left it buried forever? If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the shadows, please like this video, subscribe to Dark Lantern Stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next forgotten mystery. Until next time, keep your lantern close and stay out of the dark. The first heavy snow of winter covered Blackstone Hollow in silence. Roofs turned white. Chimneys breathed smoke into the pale morning sky. Footprints disappeared almost as soon as they were made. From a distance, the village looked peaceful again, untouched, as though nothing terrible had ever happened there. But the people knew better. They remembered the bells beneath the earth. They remembered the dead rising through mud in the square, and they remembered the night St. Bartholomew's vanished into fire and stone. Thomas Reed stayed until the roads began to freeze over. Each day he wrote by candlelight in the tavern, recording every detail before memory could soften it. Samuel Vale was gone by then, buried on the edge of the hill he had feared all his life. Thomas visited the grave each morning before dawn. Snow gathered on the headstone. Ravens perched in silence nearby. One evening, on the night before he was set to leave Blackstone Hollow forever, Thomas climbed the hill one last time. Wind moved across the snow in thin ribbons. The ruins of St. Bartholomew's lay buried beneath it, hidden beneath stone and ice and silence. Thomas stood there for a long while, with gloved hands in his coat pockets, and watched the sky darken over the valley. He told himself it was over, buried again, sealed beneath the earth. Yet he could not forget what he had uncovered near the edge of the collapse. That small iron ring, half buried beneath the snow. Another door beneath the hill, older than the church, older than the prison below it. Another layer hidden deeper still. He had covered it without a word. He had told no one. Some truths had already cost Blackstone Hollow too much. As darkness settled, Thomas turned to leave. Then he heard it, faint beneath the frozen earth. One single bell toll, deep, hollow, so quiet it might have been the wind passing through stone. Thomas stopped. Snow drifted around him. Nothing moved. No lights on the hill. No footprints but his own. He waited. No second bell came. At dawn, he left Blackstone Hollow by horse and never returned. Years later, he published many accounts of forgotten villages, lost prisons, and buried histories. But one manuscript remained locked away and unfinished in a leather trunk beside his bed. It carried no title, only one line written across the cover in black ink, what was buried beneath the abandoned church. He never shared it. Blackstone Hollow still appears on old maps, though smaller now, nearly swallowed by forest. Travelers passing through say there is no church on the hill anymore, only stone buried under grass. Yet some claim that on winter nights, when the fog hangs low and snow begins to fall, a bell can still be heard beneath the ground just before midnight. One toll, then silence. Thank you for joining us tonight on Dark Lantern Stories. If you stayed with us until the very end, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is there right now. And tell us this. If you found an iron door buried beneath the snow with no key and no name, would you open it, or would you leave it buried forever? If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to Dark Lantern Stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next journey into the shadows. Until next time, keep your lantern close and stay out of the dark.